patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. Happy President's Day to all of you. I hope that you're having a great long weekend, and I'm so glad you're able to join us today for a special President's Day episode. Today, I've decided to bring back our very first interview guest, Denzel Johnson, back on the show. He's been a very strong supporter since the time I just got started at the drawing board for this. And I'm so glad he's able to make it here and to be able to share with us a little bit about what President's Day means to him, and as well as his top 5 presidents. I decided that it would be appropriate to not just obviously commemorate the legacy and the life of George Washington, our first president, whose birthday was, I believe, on February 22nd, although because of the change with the Georgia calendar and everything, so it's a bit mixed. But usually we commemorate him on the 22nd of February. However, his birthday also commemorates the presidents entirely, from the very first one all the way to the current one, to the 46th president of Joe Biden. Now, I will also be participating a little bit in terms of my top 5 presidents, and it should be very interesting to see how much we agree and disagree on what we look for in presidents, because I think this is also one of the great things about President's Day, is that we appreciate the presidents in different ways, and sometimes it's hard to judge certain presidents depending on the context, but I think the appreciation that we all have for the office of the presidency is what really unites us all. So Denzel, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Sherman. It's great to be here.
All righty. Well, I want to kickstart this episode today with just a few basic questions about President's Day, but first really about the office of the presidency, because I think this is something that is often confused with the president, right? There's President Joe Biden, but then there's the President of the United States. A bit of a distinction there. So what does the office of the President of the United States mean to you as an American citizen?
Well, as an American citizen, I think the office of the president is a very significant aspect of our society. When people think of the president, the president of the United States or the office of the president, there's just this idea of the leader, the center of attention when it comes to the United States and just America abroad. And at least for me, I think it's a very important position that must not be taken lightly. It's a position of leadership, and you have the ability to influence not just fellow Americans, but people around the world. So it's not just a matter of how your policies are enacted, but also, your perception to the international community.
How influential do you think is it for the president to be able to not just be the president or the leader of his or her own party, but also be a representation of the previous presidents to some degree in terms of the legacy and the traditions that come along with the office?
Well, yeah, I was reading an article the other day, and it was said that with previous presidents, and those currently serving, there is some degree of legacy that maintains. With this current president, President Biden, I'm not sure the extent to which some of the legacies and policies of President Trump will remain. However, I think like I said earlier, it is a very important role. And, as a president is seeking to be this visionary, seeking to be this person that sets the legacy, it requires them to be able to, work together with Congress and everyone else within the administration, because like we would learn, in graduate school, the president, yes, is the leader of the country, has the face, of America, but he or she is not the end all be all. We live, we have checks and balances in this country. So president doesn't have all the power.
Right, exactly. Now, on to President's Day specifically. Do you celebrate President's Day, and how do you celebrate it every year?
Honestly, I don't ever really celebrate it. I know that it comes up, and now being a federal employee, I know that I don't work on that day. But when you had sent me an email and asked me to come on the podcast, kind of got me to sit back and think about our country, the history, the legacy, and especially with just this new transition, new administration, everything we've been through in 2020. It's kind of I think it's really important for Americans, and not just Americans, people in the world, to sit back and just reflect on this country, on the very first president, George Washington, and kind of ask themselves, like, what would he do if he was here, or what would he think? What would he think about the state of our country? Because he's known as the founder, right? So it's like, is this what he envisioned? After the American Revolution, right?
Right, exactly. I think the same thing too. When I think of the significance of Washington's farewell address, but also just how everything that culminated to that speech, to that address to the nation, and not just the nation at the time, but for future generations up until the present day. He wanted to leave that lasting message to people, and not for fame, but because he himself learned a lot about the office of the presidency, even though he was one of the ones who helped establish it, one of the ones who helped create the capacity to be able to influence policy on such a major level. Of course, at that time, U.S. was a lot smaller, but fast forward, 220 years or so, and you're seeing a different world. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunity to be able to reflect on how much the country has progressed, and that's one of the other things that I think is great about President's Day, is thinking about the progress that presidents have made. I've always told people about this, but I believe that every president, regardless of party, regardless of the circumstances, has entered the office trying to make the country better. I just don't believe in this idea that there's this president who goes in the office to destroy the country. It's just such bad rhetoric, I think. And I'm sure that you'll agree with that too, Denzel, especially as we celebrate President's Day today. I want to now kind of go, before we get into our top 5 presidents, quick question about kind of what you look for in a president. This differs from person to person. For the purposes of today's episode, what are the things that you were really looking at as you were thinking about your top 5 presidents?
Well, for me, I look at, for one, the policies that they're planning to enact, and the degree to which I think they can actually do what they said they're going to do. And also, I look at their character as well. And I think character is a really, really important aspect of a president. I know that we've had many discussions about this over the last several years, about the importance of being in the office of president, holding yourself to a higher standard as far as speech and conduct. So as far as the character, that's something I really think is important. And I like to find a balance, though, because I'm not going to go ahead and jump on the train of president who I think is has a plus character just because they're a good person. But I'm also going to look at, all right, what about their policies? So I think it's important to balance that. And of course, I mean, when I say balance, you can't really balance that as kind of like a compromise. It's kind of a give and take. It's what you prioritize over other things. And at least for me, since me and you, we both have masters in international affairs. Like, I have a tendency to look at the foreign policy implications of different presidents. So I care about domestic politics, of course, but somebody's gonna have a conversation with me about the president. I'm kind of like, all right, let's talk about national security, defense, foreign affairs. So yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, let's get into it. Denzel, you start first since you're our guest today. So what is your number 5 president on your list?
So I put President George H.W. Bush, our namesake, the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M, and I really respect him as a president and also as a leader. We saw so much of his character and his the way he was honored. Being the namesake of our school.
That's a good choice. What do you think of Bush's performance during Operation Desert Storm, a war that I think was so successful and so challenging to manage at the same time?
It definitely was a very complicated situation. It required, compromise on both sides, in order to build a coalition. So I definitely have respect for him in the sense that he had to really, harken down and, roll with the punches in building up this coalition to, to accomplish the mission. So, anything that has happened in the past with respect to U.S. involvement in the Middle East, I think it's always a complicated situation with, as far as sending in troops, as far as executing an objective, whether it's, getting Saddam out of Kuwait or, getting ISIS out of, Iraq and Syria. It's always very difficult to, build a strong coalition that's effective.
Very good. All right. Well, I will start out with my number five, and this might surprise some people here. But the more I read about him, the more interesting he becomes, and that's unfortunately the way. That's the way things are with some presidents. My number five is Grover Cleveland. I don't say that also just because I grew up in a house next to Cleveland Avenue. There's absolutely no bias whatsoever. But I chose Cleveland because so a bit about Cleveland. So he became president in the election of 1884, and he was being president for one term, and then he ran for re-election in 1888, lost to Benjamin Harrison, who was also the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison. Benjamin Harrison turned out to be a pretty big disaster, and Cleveland was able to get the nomination again from the Democrats, and he won again in 1892. So he is the only president who counts as two presidents, the 22nd and the 24th president. What I like about Cleveland was that not only did he have really good character, he was honest, he was very, very visionary in many ways. He was a Democrat, but he was fiscally conservative. And he also got a lot of support from the Republicans. It's actually really astounding to see how much bipartisan support he got. He was very focused on political reform, especially on corruption, on like a spoil systems sort of epidemic that was going on in the federal government. It really became very bad, especially in times during the Grant administration. But there were a lot of people just telling him, like, you should just fill in all these political appointments with all yes men, right? Because you're president. And he refused to do so. He actually kept many Republicans in the administration because he believed they were effective. And he was strong support of, not having these high tariffs. That he also was very influential in going after, monopolies. Just a lot of very at that time, especially very, very groundbreaking things. Unfortunately, the Panic of 1893, which was the economic depression, really unfortunately sunk his presidency in many ways. However, despite that, he actually still kept a pretty good profile throughout his presidency. And one thing I really like about Cleveland's support is that he got a lot of support from a wing of the Republican Party, and this wing essentially went with Cleveland because they hated the financial corruption going on with James Blaine, who was a prominent Republican at the time. And these people bucked their party so many times to side with Cleveland because Cleveland really was so focused on this political reform during his administration. So I'm going to say Cleveland because I think he really is one of the unique presidents who was able to get that kind of support, but also have that character to stand on his own 2 feet and be able to lead the country through some very difficult times, but also some very major reforms. So I would say Cleveland is number five. So Denzel, your turn for number four.
So for number four, I would say President Jimmy Carter. So it's one of the longest living presidents still alive, right? So for me, I think, I saw that, he was really influential because, as I mentioned before, I'm very interested in foreign affairs. So one of the things that comes to mind with as far as President Carter is, everything that was happening in the Middle East, Camp David, of course, but also, and as have spoke about it before, the Iran hostage crisis. So after the Iranian Revolution, and just how President Carter was able to lead the charge and getting our Americans back safely.
Very good. And what do you think about his post presidency? I know that we're talking about presidents, in terms of their terms, but Carter having left office in 1980, which is still kind of hard to believe that it's been 41 years since he left office. But what do you like about Carter, especially when he was after president? With all the work that he's been doing up until even today, into his 90s.
Well, I think he really has a servant heart. I saw that, just a lot of the different things he's been involved with in service and, help philanthropic efforts. This man really embodied, public service as a noble calling, as, which is the motto of, our school at Texas A&M. So I really appreciate that, even in his 90s, he's still out there. He's still working hard. I think he's bedridden right now. I think he got an injury recently or something like that. But regardless, like he's still out there. He's still working hard. So that's the kind of leader I want to be. When in the future, to always keep on keeping on and pressing forward. And even when you're not in a formal office, that you're always looking to bring value everywhere you go.
Very true. President Carter can teach us a lot about that. So I want to side on you with that particular point. So I'm going to go to number 4 for me, and I had a tough time with this one. I don't know why, but I decided that I got to throw in Abraham Lincoln in here. Lincoln, some people might be surprised that he's not even top 3. I think number 4 is still pretty good, though. I just personally have some other favorites ahead of him. I don't think there's a whole lot to say about why Lincoln is one of my favorites. He won an election when he got less than 40% of the vote. First of all, I think that's pretty extraordinary. In 1860, he won because the Democratic Party couldn't figure out who was going to represent them because they were completely divided on this. But Lincoln, had there were so many opportunities where he could have done it the easy way. Like he could have just said that, we really don't need to go about through this war and all that. He probably could have gone with the whole rhetoric of, don't incite, war against your own people or something. He could have just gone with that and be safe, like James Buchanan tried to do. But Buchanan, I think, was the one who, in my opinion, was a bit of a coward. I have to say that because he was so ingrained in the legal stuff that he was like, well, I can't really do anything about it. But Lincoln was like, no, we have to preserve the Union. That was his number one thing. And I think he was absolutely right to do so. And it took very extraordinary circumstances for him to be able to do what he had to do. But nonetheless, I think his courage really has to be admired. There's no way around it. Honest Abe, Abraham Lincoln was my number 4. Denzel, how about your number 3 favorite president?
So number 3 is going to be President Ronald Reagan. And, he's someone that I really always think about, as not just a great policymaker, but also just a great person in general. Like I mentioned, I really look at the character of the president as well. And I just think he's an all around, just a great individual. One of the things that I really respected about him was, one of his most significant aspects of his administration, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, I think his instrumental leadership in that was just profound for the U.S. and for the whole world. Just finally being able to see the repressive communist era be turned down.
Now, a few days ago, we lost a really great statesman who was part of the Reagan administration, former Secretary of State George Shultz, who passed away at the age of 100. Pretty remarkable that he's had a very long life of public service. My question, Denzel, is how important do you think it is that a president is able to not only lead an administration, but also just be surrounded by very close advisors, some of whom, or maybe many of whom, might even disagree with the president on certain issues. How important is that to you for the president of the United States to consider?
Well, I really like that you mentioned that question. I was actually reading a leadership book earlier today about that, And I think not even just the president, but for really anyone in a position of leadership, it's really important to have a wise council of advisors around you. Like it says in Proverbs, there's wisdom in many counsel. So I think, like you're mentioning, these people, the president, the leader, in any position, like you have to have people that are able to call you out when you're out of line and to be able to disagree with you and to shed light on a different aspect. And I think for many people who may have been in leadership who have an issue with that, I think that comes down to pride, thinking that you can do it all on your own and that you're always right. And that's not true. Everyone sees things from a different perspective. So when you're able to, you know, sit down and be like, hey, this is the policy I want to enact, and then your deputy secretary of state's like, no, it's not going to work, and you're like, okay, let's talk about it. Just having it, be able to have a dialogue. So I think, yeah, at least for me, I think in the military they call that redlining. So just being able to have someone, to poke holes in some of the things that you say or you want to do, and then sitting back and be like, all right, let's improve this, let's adapt and overcome.
Absolutely. And my dad's first ever vote was for Ronald Reagan, and he still remembers that vote. We got to go to the Reagan Library. So, Denzel, if you haven't been to the Reagan Library Museum, definitely should go when things reopen. It's one of the best museums I've ever been to. Not just because it's Ronald Reagan, but because it's such a great quality museum down in Southern California. So. Anyway, I will go for my number 3, which is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy is, I know that if President Roosevelt was around, he would not like to be called Teddy, but I'm going to call him Teddy anyway because it's a great name. But President Roosevelt, I think, represented a number of different things. First is that I think it's the environment issue, and now I think the current climate really, and when I say climate, I mean political climate. The political climate does not allow really for really robust conversation about how to protect the environment, and maybe that was kind of maybe also the case back in those days. But Roosevelt really made that a priority, and he tried to do things that refocus the conversation, and did not do so in a very radical way that all of a sudden people are kind of pitted against each other and all that. He really wanted to make a stand on that. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that he had a very robust foreign policy. When you think about the Panama Canal, the construction of the Panama Canal, how much you can imagine how much of a difference it made on trade, and it really changed the way we looked at ourselves really in the Americas. And he also really believed, most importantly, that the United States was an emerging power. That was going to be a world power. He truly believed in that, and he decided to do what he could to project force, but not to do so in an imperialist manner. To do so, perhaps in a different manner where America was about influence and inspiration to some degree, with our values and principles. It was also about expanding trade, about developing new relations. So this was in the wake of the Spanish-American War, which really kind of almost opened the floodgates to some degree for America to project itself. And the other thing also is Teddy Roosevelt also was an interesting guy. He ran against his own party in 1912. He had trained. I guess he kind of trained President Taft a little bit, but Taft did not turn out to be the guy whom he thought he was. And when Teddy felt that this was not the way the country was supposed to go, he ran third party for the Bull Moose Party, and he still got a lot of support. He was so popular. I don't think you can really often see how popular a president was other than Teddy Roosevelt. And he also had a great character, a very venturous guy, like a Rough Rider sort of personality. We'll never forget Teddy Roosevelt. So he's one of my favorites, one of my favorite presidents of all time. So he gets number 3 for me. Okay, Denzel, no, we're almost there to number 1, but let's number 2, the runner-up. What's your number 2 president?
So I'd say number 2 is President Abraham Lincoln. I know that you mentioned him earlier, and I really respect him, as a president, as a leader, as a person, because of all the work he did with especially ending slavery, and this is leadership during the Civil War. So, when I think of someone that's a great leader, a great statesman, just a great person overall, I think of Abraham Lincoln.
Very good. What is your favorite part of like Lincoln's a career up to president? Because he grew up in a very poor household. He was in Illinois politics, which maybe nowadays is perhaps not the best in political environment you can be for anyone. But he was in Illinois politics against Stephen Douglas. Is there anything about Lincoln's early life that you find really extraordinary about him?
Yeah, I mean, for one, not just his background, but just how he had a persistent character and personality. That he failed multiple times in elections. With state house and senate, but he kept on coming back stronger. So even though for someone who really felt his call to political office, that definitely shows it, because maybe after the second, first or second round of losing, I think most people might just be like, okay, it's time to hang up the coat. But he's like, no, I'm called to this. This is what I've been made to do. So, he kept on chugging along, and then he was president.
Well, in the future, we definitely have to do an episode also on like what kind of president would Lincoln would have been after the war. I think that's always been a big question on people's minds when you think about his policies, but also his approach. We're not going to get too much into that, and Denzel, I want to get your quick thoughts on this too. But I think he honestly would have. Would have done a pretty good job, because I think he understood in a way the power of the federal government. How long he would have put federal troops in the South is kind of unknown, but I think he probably had the resolve to do so. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I like you're saying. I think he was able to deal with everything going on during the war, and ending slavery. And so in a post war world, I think he would have the character, tenacity, and due diligence to lead effectively.
For sure. So, all right. Well, my number two is Dwight D. Eisenhower. I did not know a whole lot about Eisenhower when I was younger. I had heard of some things about him, but the more I read about him, the more I'm impressed by who he is. And this is just my opinion, but when it comes to kind of like the broad bipartisan support for president, I think he was the last time we've had a president like that. That kind of desire for both sides to have him as their nominee. A party leader is kind of hard to put it there, because he was very, very bipartisan in so many ways. But Eisenhower was nominated. He decided to join the Republican Party because he liked the foreign policy platform better, and he didn't like the Democrat platform as much when it came to confronting the Soviets. He decided that he also wanted to make sure that Robert Taft or some other Republicans out there were not going to be isolationists. He really believed that was the wrong way to go. But he could have honestly been nominated to the Democratic Party, still would have been as amazing as he was. You think about the interstate system, the ability now for when you go on a family vacation, or you go somewhere, you travel on those interstate highways. That was his idea under his administration. Anything about the space race? We were behind when the Soviets had Sputnik and everything, and he knew that he had to do something about it. The creation of NASA and the space program. His tough early stance, not just on ideology, but on power as well, against the Soviets by ramping up our intelligence, which was still in its very early stages, even during the Truman administration. And he, as a military general, he also had that kind of discipline, the discipline that we like to see with presidents. But I think he also surrounded himself with people who may have differed on his views. He nominated Supreme Court justices that were not, either conservative or liberal. He chose a kind of a bit of a mixture there. Eisenhower, I think, is one of my heroes, one of my military heroes, as well as presidential heroes, and I don't think we'll ever see a man like him anymore. He's just such a unique character himself that he can never be replicated. So I'm going to say Eisenhower is my number 2. So now, for the you do the drum roll here, we'll do our number 1 president. So Denzel, what is your number 1 president?
It's going to be President George Washington.
Yeah.
A great nation, the very first American, I would say, first great American, and as we know, he was the commander in chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. Replacing the Articles of Confederation, by drafting the U.S. Constitution. And these documents that we have today, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, these embody everything that we do as Americans. It is a guiding force. I mean, we have the Supreme Court. Literally, these justices, are ruling on different laws based on the U.S. Constitution. This is the foundation of our democracy. And you look around the world, and you see many other different countries who've had several different constitutions and revolutions here and there, but as of now, the U.S. Constitution has remained stable and steadfast through it all. So, if it wasn't for his leadership in leaving Britain and coming out here to the U.S., we wouldn't be the country we are today. So, I'd like to know what. I know I would like to know what he would think about just everything that's going on today. How he would be, and how would George Washington lead in 2021? That'd be an interesting question I'd have.
Oh, we need to invent a time machine at some point and be able to bring him back to the present day and ask him directly. I'm gonna first of all just say that my number 1 was also George Washington. No surprise there. My podcast is named Friends and Fellow Citizens, named after the words of George Washington. So it's no surprise there, and very fitting, Denzel, that our number 1 president, our list finally converged onto our common number 1 president. I want to associate myself with your words there on Washington, because he honestly could have had anything he wanted. After the war, there could have been he could have just said, you know what, we won the war. I was ahead of it. Honestly, there was no one who could really challenge him on a number of things. There were attempts, but they all really failed pretty horribly, and he decided not to do that. And to see that kind of character is really extraordinary. Now, that's not to say that he didn't have political ambitions. I mean, he didn't want to be president, but he certainly wanted to provide direction, and he presided over the Constitutional Convention. But he really did not want to be up at the highest level of office. He maybe just felt that he wasn't there for the job necessarily. He believed that there were maybe some other people who wanted it, who could have done a better job. But he in a way, even though he didn't want to do it, but he answered the call to public service, and he knew that the country needed a leader, needed to step up. And I think also knew that the administration that he was going to lead is going to be a real test. I mean, there were so many tests there: Whiskey Rebellion, the French and British were kind of at it again to some degree, but then there was the French Revolution that was going on. There was some chaos going on around the world, and he had to really navigate through that. He learned so much. I think he probably would agree that as he was becoming president, he was learning alongside the nation about how to lead a country, and he just embodies so much of what we like to stand for, and he will always be a model. He will always be the man who I think many would say was chosen by God, and I do believe he kind of is, because I don't think there was anybody even as great as a guy like Jefferson, Adams, really really smart people, Madison as well. I don't think any of them would have done as good of a job as Washington on this becoming the first president. I think he established that office, and the people who followed him in particular capacity really looked up to him and made the office of the presidency to what it is now. So, Denzel, well, we have done our top 5 presidents. I'm really glad that we did this episode today. I want to give you an opportunity, just if you have any some final comments about the presidents or about today's episode, I'm certainly going to give you the opportunity to do so. And but I want to say that today really is a special day for myself, yourself, to the fans and the audience of Friends and Fellow Citizens, and to the nation and world. But do you want to have anything to add on before we conclude today's episode?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, as we were talking about George Washington, one of the things that I felt like he left as a legacy was, in 1783 when he resigned his commission as commander in chief. I think this action was significant in establishing, civilian, rather than military rule, leading to our democracy rather than, dictatorship or monarchy, which we left, we left in Europe. So I think that that's a really important thing to highlight about George Washington. But as far as everything else that we've been discussing, like I said earlier, I think that President's Day is important. I think that the office of presidency is an important office that should not be taken lightly. I know that a lot of people have complained in the past about why do we have presidents who are so old, or why they're not 35 like the cutoff age is, and I think that you know effective leadership comes with time and patience, and I won't say that every single president we had was necessarily extremely effective or the best president overall, but I think that leading such a country like the United States with all its diversity in terms of people, policies, and procedures, and I think it's not something to be taken lightly, not something you can just waltz into. So, I have great respect for anyone, and I mean anyone who's ever been the president of this great nation.
And a great note to end on our episode today. Denzel, thank you so much for being on to the show again. You're the first ever guest, and you will always be in the history books of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I really appreciate you joining me today on this special President's Day episode. And I want to thank all the audience, too, for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and family. Have a great rest of your President's Day holiday. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time on Friends and Fellow Citizens.